bizarre murder case that involves a woman found dead inside a commercial freezer. We first reported this story last night at 10 o'clock, and now we're learning more about the woman's husband, who's accused of killing her. Channel 2's Roseanne Aragon live now with the latest. Roseanne?
That's right. That man violated felony bond conditions. Crime Stopper says this death was preventable.
It was right by the book. She told authorities, if I disappear.
In Houston, Texas, Chi Thi-Lien Lu was known for her warmth, her ambition, and her devotion to family. At just 29 years old, she had dreams of a better life. Yet those dreams were tragically cut short in the most horrifying of ways. Her husband, Curtis Allen Holliday, a local businessman, appeared to be the man she trusted. But behind closed doors, their marriage was unraveling. What began as a hopeful union quickly turned dark, culminating in a discovery that no one could have predicted. In July 2020, Chi's body was found in the most unsettling of places, stuffed inside a freezer, her lifeless form frozen in time. A letter, written by Chi herself months earlier, would become the chilling key to the investigation, leading authorities straight to Curtis. What happened in the days and months leading up to Chi's death? How did a marriage that once held promise descend into something so unthinkable? Let's uncover the story. Chi Thi-Lien Lu came to the United States from Vietnam in her early 20s, eager to build a new life and create a future filled with promise. She settled in Houston, Texas, where she found a tight-knit community of friends and family who admired her warmth, kindness, and ambition. Chi's journey was one of hard work and perseverance, traits that earned her respect wherever she went. Those who knew her described her as someone who always put others first, especially her family. She was a dedicated daughter, a loyal friend, and most importantly, a loving wife. Her smile was infectious, and her spirit radiant. Chi's dream was simple: to live a life full of love, stability, and opportunity. She worked tirelessly, striving to give herself and her family the life they deserved. But, like so many, Chi's aspirations weren't just limited to her career or her relationships. She yearned for something deeper, a lasting, loving marriage. It was this hope that led her to Curtis Allen Holliday, a man she thought would stand by her side through thick and thin. Curtis, a local businessman, seemed to fit the role of the loving husband she had always imagined. He was well-spoken, appeared successful, and to those on the outside, their relationship looked like one built on shared goals and mutual respect. They married, and for a time, it seemed like Chi's dreams were coming true. The early years of their marriage were filled with promise. They made plans, built a life together, and began to settle into the rhythm of their shared future. But like many relationships, there were cracks beneath the surface, cracks that were not immediately visible to those around them. For those closest to Chi, the changes in Curtis were more evident. He was controlling, often volatile, and at times, his jealousy seemed to consume him. Friends and family began noticing subtle signs of tension, arguments that were more than the usual couple spats, and a sense of unease that crept into Chi's once joyful demeanor. Chi had confided in a few close friends about her concerns, but she never openly admitted to the extent of the problems in her marriage. Still, she had her suspicions. She could sense Curtis's possessiveness growing, a tightening grip that threatened to smother the life she had worked so hard to build. At times, she would withdraw into herself, quietly reflecting on the future that seemed uncertain. She still loved him, but a part of her knew that something wasn't right. As their marriage progressed, Curtis's behavior became more concerning. He was no longer the man she had married. Friends recall instances when they had seen Curtis's temper flare, his words sharp and cutting. It wasn't just the arguments anymore. It was the intimidation, the isolation, and the subtle but undeniable shift in their relationship. Chi's life, which had once been filled with light and laughter, began to feel darker and more confined. At the start of 2020, things took a sharp turn. Curtis was arrested and charged with assault after a violent confrontation with Chi. The legal documents revealed a history of escalating abuse. The severity of the situation sent shockwaves through Chi's close-knit community, but even then, the full extent of Curtis's behavior was not entirely clear. The court issued a restraining order, prohibiting Curtis from having any contact with his wife. Yet, Despite this legal barrier, Chi's fears remained. Those closest to her described how she seemed increasingly anxious, her once vibrant spirit now dampened by the constant threat of violence. Chi's life, once full of hope and promise, had become a suffocating existence under Curtis's control. Her desire to keep her family intact clashed with the terrifying reality of the man she had married. She knew she needed to escape, but the path to freedom was clouded with fear and uncertainty. Friends recall the difficulty in convincing her to take the necessary steps to protect herself, even after the restraining order. Curtis's influence lingered in the background, and Chi's emotional turmoil grew as she tried to navigate the complexities of leaving a man she feared but also loved. Behind closed doors, Curtis's behavior had become unpredictable and, at times, dangerously erratic. What had started as a marriage filled with potential was now a twisted and volatile reality. It was clear to those around her that Chi was trapped, torn between the love she once had for Curtis and the growing terror she felt living in a relationship defined by abuse and manipulation. By the time Curtis's arrest occurred in January 2020, it was already too late. The seeds of fear and dread had been planted long before, but no one could have predicted the horrific conclusion of Chi's story. In January 2020, the dark undercurrents of Chi T-Lin Lee's marriage reached a breaking point. Curtis Allen Holliday was arrested for assaulting Chi, marking the end of a fragile peace. The court, recognizing the severity of the situation, issued a restraining order, prohibiting Curtis from having any contact with her. It was a step toward her freedom, a legal barrier meant to offer her safety. Yet, despite this, the feeling of unease never left Chi. Friends and family described her as still fearful, anxious, and unsure about her future. But even with the restraining order in place, Curtis seemed to be everywhere. He continued to haunt the edges of Chi's life, lingering in the shadows, even as his actions became more erratic and unpredictable. To those who saw him, he was a man teetering on the edge, someone who had lost control and was determined to keep a grip on everything he once possessed, including Chi. As the months passed, Chi's friends and neighbors began to notice something unsettling. They hadn't seen her in weeks, and it was unlike Chi to disappear without a word. She was always quick to respond to calls or messages. She never missed a chance to check in with her family, her friends, and her community. But in the summer of 2020, the silence grew deafening. It wasn't just the absence of Chi's presence, it was the absence of any signs that she was still alive. Neighbors who lived near Chi's apartment were among the first to express their concern. They recalled seeing Curtis around the neighborhood, but they hadn't seen Chi for some time. It was as though she had simply vanished without a trace. The months that followed her last known interactions would become a blur, an eerie calm that preceded the worst discovery of all. It was late July 2020 when the unthinkable happened. A call to the police brought investigators to a house in southwest Houston, a house that had once been home to Chi and Curtis. The landlord, who had recently been checking the property after receiving complaints of strange smells coming from inside, had made the discovery. What they found inside that home would forever alter the course of the investigation and reveal the horrors Chi had endured in silence. Chi's body was found in a freezer, frozen solid with frost clinging to her skin. She had been stuffed inside, hidden away like a forgotten object. Her lifeless form, the victim of a crime that no one could have predicted, told a story that words never could. The authorities were called immediately, and what followed was a grim investigation into the chilling circumstances surrounding Chi's death. The autopsy confirmed that Chi had died from blunt force trauma, but what struck investigators even more was the eerie state in which her body was found. It was clear that she had been dead for some time. When the police arrived, Curtis was nowhere to be found. His absence was telling, and immediately, suspicion turned toward him. The house, once shared by the couple, now stood as a silent witness to the darkness that had consumed their marriage. Investigators combed through the scene, gathering evidence, and piecing together the timeline of Chi's final days. But it wasn't just the freezer that sent chills down their spines, it was the discovery of a letter Chi had written months before, one that now felt like a desperate plea for help. In the letter, she had written chilling words: "If suddenly nobody can find me, or find me dead, please check my husband." It was as though Chi had known her life was in danger, as if she had anticipated the end before it came. This letter became the linchpin in the investigation, leading police to focus entirely on Curtis Holliday. But Curtis's behavior in the aftermath raised more questions than answers. In the days following Chi's disappearance, he had been unreachable. Neighbors reported that he had suddenly stopped showing up in the neighborhood, and his business operations appeared to come to an abrupt halt. It seemed as though he had disappeared just as completely as Chi had. There were no clear alibis, no evidence that could account for his whereabouts during the critical days leading up to and following Chi's death. As authorities closed in, they discovered that Curtis had been hiding in plain sight. In the days after the discovery of Chi's body, Curtis was found at a location far from Houston, attempting to evade capture. His actions, his sudden flight, his inability to provide a coherent explanation for his movements, and his refusal to cooperate with investigators, spoke volumes. The man who had once appeared as a successful businessman was now nothing more than a fugitive, desperately trying to escape the weight of the crime he had committed. The discovery of Chi's body, the letter she left behind, and Curtis's suspicious behavior all pointed to the same conclusion. Curtis Holliday had played a central role in his wife's death. The shocking crime left more than just physical evidence behind. It raised the haunting question of how a man could turn on the person he once vowed to love and protect. How could a marriage that had seemed to hold so much promise descend into this kind of horror? The investigation had only just begun, but already, the tragic story of Chi Ti-Lin Lu was unfolding, piece by piece. And with each new revelation, the truth became ever clearer. The woman who had dreamed of a better life had paid the ultimate price for trying to escape the darkness of her own home. Once Chi Ti-Lin Li's body was discovered, the investigation into her death intensified. Detectives from the Houston Police Department worked quickly to piece together the details surrounding her disappearance and the events that led to the gruesome discovery of her frozen body. The scene at the house, where Chi had once lived with her husband, was chilling. The freezer in which Chi had been stuffed stood as a silent witness to the horrors that had unfolded within the walls of their home. The investigators knew that every piece of evidence, every clue, was crucial in understanding the truth behind Chi's death. The first task was to gather forensic evidence from the scene. There were signs of a struggle, small clues that suggested Chi had fought to survive. Bloodstains, scattered items, and signs of disturbance hinted at the violence that had preceded her tragic end. Autopsy reports confirmed that Chi had died from blunt force trauma, and her body had been left in the freezer, abandoned in a state of cold and neglect. But it wasn't just the physical evidence that would prove critical. It was the emotional weight of Chi's final words that would drive the investigation forward. As detectives continued to sift through the house, a key discovery was made, a letter. Typed, neatly and hauntingly precise, the letter Chi had written months earlier seemed to predict her own death. "If suddenly nobody can find me, or find me dead, please check my husband," Chi had written. The words were a desperate plea, a grim warning that cast a long shadow over Curtis Holliday. This letter, found amidst the remnants of Chi's life, became the centerpiece of the investigation. It spoke volumes about her fears, her realization that her life was in danger, and her deep concern about the man she had once loved. It seemed as though Chi had known what was coming, and in writing the letter, she had reached out for help in the only way she knew how. The letter did more than just raise suspicions. It became the linchpin that led investigators directly to Curtis. It was clear now that Curtis had been the central figure in Chi's life, and, by extension, the key suspect in her death. Detectives dug deeper into the couple's past, speaking to friends, family, and neighbors who had witnessed the unraveling of their marriage. What they found painted a picture of a troubled and increasingly volatile relationship. The pattern of abuse, the controlling behavior, and the escalation of violence all pointed toward Curtis as the one responsible for Chi's suffering. But Curtis wasn't just sitting idly by while the investigation took place. After the discovery of Chi's body, he had gone to ground, disappearing from the area. Authorities began searching for him, but he had gone to great lengths to evade capture. Friends and family members reported that they hadn't seen him for days, and his business dealings came to an abrupt halt. It seemed as though Curtis had vanished without a trace. The timing of his disappearance was telling. He was nowhere to be found in the days immediately after Chi's body was discovered. As the investigation intensified, authorities received a tip that Curtis had been spotted in a neighboring city. He was reportedly hiding out, hoping to escape the growing attention surrounding his wife's death. Detectives soon learned that he had left Houston and was trying to lay low. The man who had once been a businessman now seemed to be living in fear, desperately trying to avoid being caught. He wasn't the same man that people had once known. It wasn't long before the police tracked him down. Curtis was found in a small motel outside of Houston, attempting to avoid detection. He was arrested without incident, but his reaction to the arrest was anything but calm. Witnesses said that Curtis appeared disoriented and defensive, offering little in the way of a coherent explanation for his actions. When questioned by the police, Curtis remained largely silent, refusing to offer any insight into his whereabouts or the events that led to Chi's death. He offered no alibi, no explanation for why he had vanished after Chi's body was discovered, and no answers to the growing pile of evidence that pointed directly to him. The authorities knew that they were on the right track. Curtis's arrest was the first step toward justice for Chi. His silence only deepened the mystery, and his refusal to cooperate made it clear that he had something to hide. As detectives continued to build their case, they relied on the evidence they had collected, the letter Chi had left behind, the forensic findings at the scene, and the testimonies of those who had witnessed Curtis's increasingly erratic behavior. It was a slow, meticulous process, but every step brought them closer to the truth. As the investigation unfolded, the question that loomed large was why. Why had Curtis, a man who had once vowed to cherish Chi, turned on her so violently? What had happened in their marriage to cause it to spiral so completely into darkness? The evidence was mounting, and with each new discovery, the case against Curtis became more compelling. The letter Chi had written, her final chilling warning, now seemed like a premonition that no one had been able to heed in time. With Curtis behind bars and the investigation continuing, the pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to fit together. But even as the truth began to surface, the tragic loss of Chi Lin left a gaping hole in the hearts of those who loved her. The investigation was far from over, but already, it was clear, Curtis Holliday had been hiding more than just his whereabouts. He had been hiding the truth. As investigators worked to piece together the full story of Chi Lin Lee's life and death, they began to examine the possible motives that could have driven Curtis Allen Holliday to such an unimaginable act. What led a man, who had once made vows to protect and cherish his wife, to ultimately kill her and stuff her body into a freezer? The answers were complicated, intertwined with a history of abuse, fear, and desperation. For months leading up to her death, Chi's marriage had been deteriorating. The signs were clear to those around her, a pattern of escalating violence, a growing sense of fear, and a deep sense of emotional distress. Curtis's controlling behavior had become increasingly evident, and Chi had begun to realize that she was living in a relationship that could end in tragedy. But what was the underlying cause of this unraveling marriage? What pushed Curtis to such extremes? One theory that stood out was the ongoing domestic violence in their relationship. Curtis had a history of violent outbursts, with reports from friends, family, and even police documenting incidents of physical and emotional abuse. In January 2020, just months before Chi's death, Curtis had been arrested for assaulting her. This arrest came after a series of heated arguments and altercations, where Curtis's temper had flared, and Chi had been the one to bear the brunt of his rage. Court records show that, at the time of his arrest, Curtis was ordered to have no contact with Chi, a step that might have provided her with a chance to escape the violence, but the damage had already been done. For Curtis, the control he exerted over Chi was not just about anger or frustration, it was a matter of dominance. It became clear that Curtis was a man who had a deep fear of losing control. This fear was not just about losing his wife, it was about losing the power and influence he believed he should have over her. And when Chi began to push back, when she sought a way out through divorce, it seemed that Curtis would do anything to stop her from breaking free. Friends and family reported that Curtis had always been possessive and jealous, traits that only grew worse as the relationship continued to deteriorate. He couldn't accept the thought of Chi walking away, and the thought of losing his grip on her life pushed him to a breaking point. Jealousy, too, may have played a significant role. Friends and family of Chi described how Curtis's behavior was marked by an obsessive need to monitor her every move. The constant accusations, the need to know where she was at all times, and the emotional manipulation all pointed to a man whose jealousy consumed him. It was as if Curtis saw Chi not as an equal partner, but as an object, one that he could control, possess, and manipulate at will. When it became clear that Chi was planning to divorce him, Curtis's jealousy likely spiraled into an uncontrollable rage. The fear of losing her, and everything that came with her, may have driven him to the point of murder. Another possible motive that surfaced during the investigation was financial strain. Curtis's business dealings had begun to falter in the months before Chi's death. He had been a businessman in Houston, but reports indicated that his financial situation was worsening. In times of financial stress, some individuals can become desperate, willing to go to extreme lengths to retain what they perceive as their last source of stability. It's possible that Curtis feared losing not just his wife, but also the wealth and security that she represented in his life. While the financial aspect hasn't been fully explored in every detail, it's not unusual for financial pressure to exacerbate already existing tensions in a marriage, particularly when the individual feels their world slipping away. But as much as the evidence pointed to Curtis's deep-seated psychological issues, some questions remained. Was this truly the result of a man driven mad by jealousy and control, or could there have been other forces at play? Was anyone else involved? Or was this, as some might speculate, an accident that spiraled out of control? The theory of an accident was quickly dismissed by investigators, given the clear signs of premeditation, the restraint shown by Curtis in hiding his wife's body in the freezer, and the troubling letter Chi had left behind. There were no indications that anyone else had been involved in the crime. No accomplices, no other suspects. Curtis was the sole person tied to the crime, his history of abuse and his actions in the aftermath pointing squarely to him. His response to the police and his continued silence spoke volumes. He wasn't just trying to evade capture, he was trying to protect his version of events. He admitted to killing Chi, but his motivations remained tangled in a web of emotions that ranged from jealousy to anger to a profound need to control. One thing that became abundantly clear was that Curtis had a deeply ingrained sense of entitlement, not just over his wife, but over his entire life. He wasn't just trying to punish Chi for leaving him, he was trying to reassert his power, his dominance, and his right to control her, by any means necessary. The murder wasn't an isolated act of violence, it was the culmination of years of psychological torment, manipulation, and the overwhelming desire to possess and control. The theory that Curtis was motivated by a fear of losing his wife, combined with his history of abuse and his desperation to maintain control, seemed to fit the pieces of the puzzle perfectly. Curtis's own words in his statements to the police revealed the depth of his anger and jealousy. His unwillingness to accept that Chi was ending their marriage, and his inability to let go of the idea of owning her, became the driving force behind the horrific act he committed. The full scope of Curtis's motives may never be entirely understood, but the evidence painted a tragic portrait of a man who would do anything to keep his grip on the woman he claimed to love. It was a desperate act, fueled by rage and fear, and it ultimately led to the death of Chi Ti-Lin Lu. As the legal proceedings unfolded, the case of Curtis Allen Holliday drew significant attention, not just because of the heinous crime, but also because of the questions it raised about the justice system's handling of domestic violence cases. After his arrest and the subsequent investigation, Curtis faced serious charges for the murder of his wife, Chi Ti-Lin Lu. The evidence was damning. The chilling letter left behind by Chi, the discovery of her frozen body, and Curtis's history of abuse all pointed directly to him as the perpetrator. But the path to justice would not be a straightforward one. In June 2024, Curtis agreed to a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to the crime, which ultimately resulted in a 10-year prison sentence. The plea deal meant that Curtis would avoid the possibility of a much longer sentence, perhaps even a life sentence, in exchange for his cooperation and guilty plea. But this decision did not come without controversy. Many, including Chi's family and domestic violence advocates, were outraged by the leniency of the sentence. For Chi's family, the 10-year sentence felt like a slap in the face. a small fraction of the time Chi had lived, and a fraction of the time her killer would spend behind bars. The justice they had hoped for seemed diminished by the fact that Curtis would spend so little time incarcerated. Chi's family members, especially her parents and siblings, expressed their sorrow and frustration with the legal outcome. They were haunted by the knowledge that their daughter, sister, and loved one had endured years of abuse before her tragic death, and now, they felt that her killer wasn't being held fully accountable. Domestic violence advocates were equally upset. For them, the case highlighted significant flaws in how the legal system handles intimate partner violence. The 10-year sentence seemed to some like an insufficient response to the severity of the crime, a crime that many viewed as premeditated, stemming from years of abuse and control. The plea deal, in their eyes, not only downplayed the seriousness of the murder but also sent a troubling message about how society values the lives of victims of domestic violence. But there were deeper systemic issues at play, issues that the case brought to light. The plea deal underscored the challenges of prosecuting domestic violence cases, where victims often struggle to be heard until it's too late. In Chi's case, she had tried to take steps to protect herself. She had been brave enough to leave Curtis, to report his abuse, and even to leave behind a letter warning others about what might happen to her. Yet, despite these red flags, Curtis was able to maintain control over the narrative, and ultimately over her life. For those who fight against domestic violence, this case became a painful reminder of how often victims are failed by the systems that are supposed to protect them. Chi's tragic death highlighted the need for stronger legal protections for victims of abuse, more support for those trying to leave dangerous relationships, and more attention to the psychological effects of long-term violence. Many believed that had the legal system acted more swiftly in response to earlier incidents of abuse, especially the January 2020 assault arrest, the outcome might have been different. If only someone had intervened sooner, if only the warnings had been heeded, Chi's death might have been prevented. Yet, even with the case settled in the courts, the lingering questions and unresolved issues remained. How much did the system fail Chi in the moments leading up to her death? Could more have been done to protect her? Was Curtis's plea deal a sign of a broken justice system that undervalues the lives of those caught in cycles of domestic violence? Curtis's sentencing, though definitive, was not the closure that many had hoped for. For Chi's loved ones, the pain of losing her, and the manner in which she was taken, would never truly be erased. While some may argue that the plea deal was a necessary compromise, for Chi's family, it was a painful reminder of how justice is often imperfect. Chi's death left a void in the lives of those who loved her. Her memory lived on in the hearts of her friends and family, and her story became a rallying cry for those advocating against domestic violence. Though the legal process had run its course, the aftermath of Chi's tragic death continued to reverberate through the community. Curtis Allen Holliday's actions not only took a life, but they also underscored the pressing need for changes in how domestic violence is addressed, both in the legal system and in society at large. The case sparked conversations about how we, as a society, can do better to protect those at risk and how the justice system must evolve to ensure that victims of domestic violence are not overlooked. In the end, Chi Ti-Lin Lee's story wasn't just one of tragedy, it was also one of resilience, as her death became a catalyst for much-needed discussions on how we can better safeguard the lives of those facing abuse. As we reflect on the tragic story of Chi Ti-Lin Lee, it's impossible to ignore the broader implications of this case. Chi's life was stolen by someone she loved, someone she trusted, someone who had the power to protect her but instead chose to control and abuse her. Domestic violence is not just a private issue, it's the societal one. The scars left by abuse are often invisible, but they are real. And they can last long after the physical wounds have healed. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, remember that help is available. There are resources and organizations dedicated to providing support, safety, and a path to freedom. In Chi's memory, we must continue the fight to ensure that no one else has to suffer in silence. We encourage you to share your thoughts or experiences in the comments below. What do you think about the way the justice system handled Chi's case? How can we better protect those at risk of domestic violence? Your voice matters, and together we can create a stronger, safer community. If you're moved by this story, We urge you to support domestic violence organizations in your area. Whether through donations, volunteering, or simply spreading awareness, there are many ways to help those in need. And, if you found this story impactful, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more true crime stories that highlight the importance of justice, accountability, and change. Thank you for watching, and remember, domestic violence is a crime that affects us all. Let's stand together to make a difference.